The mind trick that makes discipline effortless. Carl Jung, let me ask you something that sounds simple, but is far more complex than it appears. Why is it so difficult to do the very things we know are good for us? We want to wake up early, eat well, exercise, study, meditate, work with focus, and yet we find ourselves consistently drawn toward comfort, distraction, and delay. We chase dopamine instead of discipline. We scroll instead of sleep. We dream of the future, but act like we're stuck in the past. And the most frustrating part, we know better. We know what we should do, and yet we don't do it. Why? This is the question that haunted me, not just as a thinker, but as a person. And it's where the teachings of Carl Jung began to unravel something profound, something that psychology, productivity gurus, and even motivational speakers often miss. Jung didn't see the mind as a machine. He saw it as a myth, a symbolic landscape where ancient forces, archetypes, move through us, far beyond our conscious will. And here's the key. Jung believed that we are not in charge of our daily actions as much as we think. Our conscious ego, the part of us that says, I want to be disciplined, is only a tiny piece of a much larger structure. The real drivers of our behavior lie deeper. And if we don't learn to work with those deeper parts of ourselves, not against them, discipline will always feel like a battle. But if we do learn the trick, if we align the unconscious with the conscious, then discipline becomes not just effortless, it becomes inevitable. So what is this mind trick? Let's start by flipping the entire model upside down. Discipline isn't about control, it's about integration. That's the Jungian insight. You don't force yourself to do hard things, you become the kind of person who naturally does them. And to do that, you must understand the parts of yourself that don't want discipline and why they exist. You must stop rejecting your inner chaos and start listening to it, because within that chaos is a message, a myth, a part of you that was wounded, ignored, or repressed. And that part is not your enemy, it's your key.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Here's where things get psychological and spiritual. Jung believed that every time we set a goal, let's say, I want to go to the gym at 6 a.m., we awaken a counterforce in the psyche. This force is often unconscious, but it's powerful. It's the part of you that says, no, I want to stay in bed. I want warmth, safety, comfort. I don't want to change. We usually treat this voice as weakness or laziness. But Jung saw it differently. He saw it as the shadow, the hidden self, the part of you that was shaped by childhood patterns, emotional wounds, and unprocessed fears. And he believed that unless we bring the shadow into the light, it will sabotage us again and again, not because it's evil, but because it's misunderstood. So what's the trick? The trick is to befriend your resistance, to stop fighting it like it's the enemy, and instead sit with it like it's your teacher. When you feel the urge to procrastinate, don't suppress it, ask it, what are you trying to protect me from? When you avoid discomfort, ask, what part of me is afraid of growth? You'll be surprised by the answers. Sometimes, the part of you that resists discipline is the same part that was shamed for making mistakes as a kid, or the part that was told they weren't good enough unless they were perfect. That part isn't lazy, it's scared. And until it feels safe, it will continue to pull you away from anything that resembles transformation. This is where the Jungian path diverges from the hustle culture. We don't beat ourselves into discipline. We heal ourselves into it. When you integrate your shadow, when you acknowledge your fears, your doubts, your inner contradictions, something strange happens. The resistance fades. The internal war ends. And in its place, a new self emerges. A self that wants growth, not out of guilt or pressure, but out of alignment. A self that doesn't need to be disciplined because it is disciplined. Now let's make this real. Imagine two people trying to write a book. One forces themselves to write every day using willpower, routines, alarms, and shame. The other spends time understanding why they avoid writing. Perhaps it's because they fear being judged, or because their creativity was stifled in childhood, or because they associate writing with failure. The second person doesn't just build a habit, they transform. They become someone who writes not because they have to, but because they've cleared the inner blocks that once made it painful. That's the difference. That's the mind trick. It's not about brute force. It's about becoming whole. So I ask you now, what parts of yourself are you fighting every day in the name of discipline? What would happen if, instead of suppressing them, you got curious? What if the key to effortless discipline isn't more pressure, but more compassion? What if the thing holding you back isn't laziness, but an unloved part of your soul? This is the Jungian path, not discipline by domination, but discipline by integration. And it changes everything. The shadow's secret contract. Why we sabotage ourselves even when we want to win. Have you ever felt like a part of you is actively working against your own success? Like no matter how badly you want to improve, to stick to your habits, to follow through, to finally become who you know you're capable of being, there's another side of you quietly pulling the strings in the opposite direction. It's not just procrastination. It's not just distraction. It's self-sabotage. You set the goal, you make the plan, you even feel the motivation, and then, at the last moment, you don't follow through. Why? Carl Jung would say it's because you have made a secret contract with your shadow. Not consciously, of course, but deep within your psyche, there is a silent agreement. If you keep me hidden, I will keep you safe. The shadow is not just a psychological concept. It's a living force inside you. It holds all the parts of you that were rejected, punished, or deemed unacceptable in your early life. And its mission is not to destroy your goals. Its mission is to protect your identity, even if that identity is small, broken, or incomplete. Even if it means keeping you stuck. Let's make this more real. Imagine someone who grew up constantly criticized by a parent. They learned early on that trying meant failing, and failing meant shame. So now, as an adult, whenever they get close to succeeding, whether it's in fitness, business, or relationships, their shadow panics, because success threatens the fragile identity they've built around being not good enough. It's safer to sabotage the goal than to face the terrifying possibility of changing who they believe they are. That's the shadow's contract. Stay small, and I'll keep you safe from shame. And here's the twist. The more brilliant, creative, and visionary you are, the more powerful your shadow tends to be. Because the higher your potential rises, the more it threatens to expose the hidden parts of you that don't feel worthy of that potential. So what looks like laziness on the surface is often deep psychological protection. What looks like a lack of discipline is really a subconscious loyalty to a past version of yourself, a version that was never allowed to thrive. Jung understood this paradox intimately. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In other words, your shadow will keep running the show until you bring it into the light. You will keep sabotaging your goals, not because you're weak, but because your psyche is loyal to a story of yourself that no longer serves you. And here's the hard part. Breaking the contract means grieving that old identity. It means letting go of the version of yourself that felt safe in mediocrity, in invisibility, in avoidance. It means stepping into a new story, and that's terrifying. Because the shadow isn't just protecting you from failure, it's protecting you from transformation. So how do we break the contract? Not with willpower, not with discipline hacks, but with radical honesty. You sit down with your shadow metaphorically, emotionally, spiritually, and you ask it, what are you trying to protect me from? You listen. You don't judge. You let it speak. And in that dialogue, something begins to shift. When the shadow feels seen, it loosens its grip. When it feels loved, it no longer needs to sabotage you to get your attention. And that's the moment when discipline becomes natural, not because the resistance is gone, but because you're no longer at war with yourself. Let me ask you a dangerous question. What part of your current identity would have to die in order for you to become who you're trying to be? What pattern would have to be released? What wound would have to be healed? Because until you're willing to face those questions, discipline will always be a struggle, a negotiation between your goals and your fears. But once you make peace with the shadow, once you renegotiate the contract with truth and courage, you unlock a new level of power, not control, not force, but alignment. harmony between your conscious desires and your unconscious needs. This is the deeper work. This is the real reason most people fail. Not because they don't want it bad enough, but because they never understood the internal contracts keeping them bound. Becoming the architect of the psyche, turning inner conflict into inner command. There comes a point in your journey when you realize the war inside you can no longer be won by choosing sides. You've tried to silence the part of you that resists, to override it with discipline, shame, and grit. You've punished yourself for not sticking to routines, for not being strong enough, for giving in to distractions. But the truth is, this inner civil war doesn't need a victor, it needs a visionary. Someone who can step above the battlefield and design a new system. Jung believed that our psyche is not a battleground, but a structure. And if you are willing to become the architect of that structure, you can turn inner conflict into inner command. Think of your mind not as a single voice, but as a parliament. There's the part of you that wants to change, the visionary. There's the part of you that fears change, the protector. There's the wounded child, the overachiever, the critic, the dreamer. All of them are real. All of them are active. And if you try to silence any of them, they'll find a way to speak louder. But if you lead them, if you become the conscious architect who listens to each voice, assigns it a role, and integrates it into a unified vision, you don't just feel powerful, you are powerful. This is where the Jungian concept of individuation becomes your blueprint. Individuation is not self-improvement. It's not productivity. It's the process of becoming whole, of harmonizing all the fragmented parts of who you are into a coherent self that can act with clarity and purpose. It's the difference between being pulled in 10 directions and moving as one. And here's the key insight. When all parts of you are aligned, discipline is no longer effort. It's expression. Your actions become a natural extension of your inner architecture. So how do you do this? You begin by identifying the voices. When you set a goal and feel resistance, ask, who is speaking right now? Is it fear? Is it a memory? Is it the voice of a parent, a teacher, a younger version of you? Give it a name. Give it a story. Because once you identify the voice, you can begin to understand its function. Every part of your psyche serves a purpose, even the ones that seem destructive. The critic is trying to protect you from embarrassment. The procrastinator is shielding you from pressure. Even your laziness may be trying to preserve energy for a deeper emotional battle you haven't acknowledged. These parts are not wrong. They're just misguided. And your job as the architect is to give them a better role, to redirect their energy toward the version of you that you are consciously building. This is where imagination becomes power. You don't just reflect, you restructure. You create rituals, not just habits. You build environments that speak to your higher self. You surround yourself with symbols, reminders, anchors, not to force behavior, but to reflect identity. Because the psyche responds to meaning. When your physical and emotional environment reinforces who you are becoming, not who you've been, every step forward feels like alignment, not resistance. And perhaps most importantly, you lead with compassion. You stop punishing yourself for inconsistency, and instead you study it. You become curious. You ask, what is this behavior trying to tell me? Because every misstep is a message. Every failure is a feedback loop. And when you listen, you learn. When you learn, you refine. And when you refine consistently, you evolve. So let me ask you now, not as a philosopher, but as someone who has walked this path, what would your life look like if every part of you was on the same team? What would happen if you stopped trying to dominate your psyche and started designing it? What if the real breakthrough you're looking for isn't in the next productivity hack, but in the moment you sit down, close your eyes, and say to every voice within you, I hear you. Let's build something better. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are simply unstructured. And the moment you choose to become the architect of your mind instead of its prisoner, discipline will stop being a struggle. It will become your signature, your art, your quiet command. A final door. Why wholeness, not willpower, unlocks your true potential. If you followed this far, then you already know. The path to effortless discipline is not paved with punishments, hacks, or forced routines. It is not about suppressing the parts of you that resist effort, but about listening to them, guiding them, integrating them. You've begun to see that what we call self-sabotage is often self-protection in disguise. That the fractured voices inside you aren't your enemies. They're your exiled allies waiting to return home. And this brings us to the final door, the realization that it is not willpower that unlocks your full potential. It is wholeness. Wholeness is a word we rarely hear in conversations about success. We hear about habits, hustle, mental toughness. But wholeness is deeper, it's quieter, but more powerful. To be whole means to no longer be divided against yourself. It means to act from a center that includes all of you, not just the polished, socially acceptable, productive parts. Carl Jung understood this. He believed that the goal of life was not perfection, it was wholeness. And discipline, as we think of it, is not the destination. It's a symptom, a natural result of internal alignment. When you are whole, your actions follow with grace, with energy, with clarity, because they are no longer in conflict with hidden parts of your psyche. Think about this. When you admire someone who is incredibly disciplined, what you're really seeing is coherence. Their values, their desires, their identity, and their actions are all aligned. There is no war in their mind, or at least there is a peace treaty, a system, and that's what gives them energy. It's not that they have more willpower, it's that they're not losing energy fighting themselves. And the same is available to you, but only if you have the courage to walk through the final door, to let go of the illusion that you need to be better and instead commit to becoming whole. This is not an easy path. Wholeness demands honesty. It requires you to look at the parts of yourself you've judged, exiled, and forgotten. It asks you to become intimate with your doubts, your wounds, your chaos, not to fix them, but to understand them, because understanding is the beginning of healing. And healing is what clears the internal resistance that makes discipline feel impossible. You don't need to fight yourself to change. You need to love yourself into alignment. Let me ask you one of the deepest questions I can. What if nothing inside you needs to be destroyed in order for you to become who you're meant to be? What if every part of your mind, even the ones you hate, holds a piece of your potential? What if the only thing blocking your effortless discipline is the belief that you're at war with yourself? This is the shift. This is the trick. Not a trick of manipulation, but of integration. When you stop seeing discipline as something you must force through resistance and start seeing it as something that emerges from alignment, everything changes. You stop dragging yourself forward. You start moving with flow. Your habits become rituals. Your goals become expressions of who you already are. And the person you want to become, you realize they were never far away. They were always waiting behind the final door, the door of wholeness. So as we close this journey, I leave you with this. You don't need more willpower. You don't need more shame. You don't need to be harder on yourself. You need to become the kind of person who no longer needs discipline as pressure, because it has become discipline as truth, as alignment, as love. The mind trick that makes discipline effortless is not a shortcut. It's a return to yourself, to your shadow, to your center. When the conscious and unconscious minds stop pulling in opposite directions, the path forward becomes not just clear, but inevitable. Become whole. And everything else will follow.